This lesson describes John Maynard Keynes and how he created the discipline of macroeconomics to address the suffering caused by the Great Depression. Now, if you remember from our earlier lesson, there is no technical definition of a depression, but we know that during the late 1929 through 1933, the United States entered the most severe recession we'd ever experienced, and that historians labeled it a Great Depression because of the amount of suffering that people in the United States endured. And what's interesting is that at the time period, there were no macroeconomists. The only type of economists there were microeconomists. And you might have heard that Herbert Hoover, who was the president of the United States, didn't do anything to deal with the Great Depression, and that all the towns where people were suffering, these slums, were called Hoovervilles because of the fact that the president didn't do anything. I would argue that Hoover gets sort of a bum rap because in reality, it was his economic advisors, the people who he turned to for advice about the economy, who told him to do nothing. And we can actually use our knowledge of microeconomics to see why Hoover's advisors, microeconomists, gave him this advice. So what we're going to look at is, what was the micro solution to unemployment? Well, the first thing to remember is microeconomists study specific individual markets. So if they wanted to understand the market where we were dealing with the most severe effect of the recession, that being unemployment, we would study the jobs market that we also call the labor market. So we're going to draw the labor market. Here we have price. Okay? Here we have quantity. Now, you should remember that the labor market is different than other markets we draw because the demand curve represents the demand for labor, meaning employers looking to hire, companies looking to hire. And the supply curve represents the supply of labor, okay? People looking for a job. So we could call these people, just to keep it simpler, job seekers, people looking for jobs. Now we're going to graph the equilibrium price in 1929, okay? And remember, 1929, we're going to say, was right before this severe recession started. This is as we reach the peak of this really profound expansion that we experienced in the 1920s. Now, instead of calling this price, we might also call this wage. We're talking about how much workers get paid, usually on an hourly basis. And if you think about what happens as we enter the early 1930s, we enter the severe recession. So please graph on your graph what would happen in 1930 or 31 as we enter the Great Depression. Hopefully, you realized that there's going to be a significant decline in the demand for labor. I'm going to call this demand 31 to represent we're now in the recession. And there's less demand for labor because there are fewer workers, fewer businesses that are looking to hire. We've just entered this really profound recession. People aren't buying goods and services. Businesses don't have all this excess product, what we call excess inventory, unsold product, and they respond by producing less, which means that they needed fewer workers. At the same time, you had more and more folks looking for jobs. So we're going to shift that supply curve to the right and label that supply 31. It's a recession. More people are unemployed. More people are looking for a job. Now notice, you guys, what this micro market predicts. This micro market predicts that in 1931, okay, the wage will decrease significantly. So wages will go down, but we will, right, go from this equilibrium point A right here to this equilibrium point B below. And if we're in equilibrium, remember, that's where supply equals demand, where we don't have very much unemployment. Hence the advice of microeconomist to Herbert Hoover to not do anything, because in effect, the market, the invisible hand, will help solve the problem. Now, there was an issue with this logic, okay? And that issue was, think about it. If someone told you you had to take a reduction in wage to keep your job during a recession, how would you react to that reality? And maybe you're thinking, well, I would take it, but it turns out some people wouldn't. They would refuse to take that reduction in wage. And that's why what ends up happening in effect is we get stuck at that initial equilibrium wage. Okay, it's kind of like the way I'm drawing this, if you think about it, a price floor, a minimum price that people are willing to take, although in this case it's put in place by workers, not by the government. I'm going to call this sticky wages. Because that's what happens in effect, is that wages get stuck. Workers are not willing to accept this lower rate of pay. And so what you end up with, if we now think about you got sticky wages, our demand and supply curves have shifted, is you end up with much, much more supply, right? Because this is quantity supplied right here in 1931, than quantity demanded in 1931. And if you've got more than supply than demand, you have tremendous unemployment. Okay, you've got all this unemployment, and that's really what happened if you look back at the data during the Great Depression. Now, remember that microeconomists said, no, don't worry, we won't get stuck here. The economy, the invisible hand, will fix it. We'll go back to the equilibrium point B. But it didn't happen because in this market there are sticky wages. And this thrust the discipline of economics into a crisis, because here you have the worst recession we've ever dealt with in the United States, the worst recession we've ever dealt with in the world. Microeconomists, the only type of economists there are, say do nothing, the problem will solve itself, and yet the problem doesn't solve itself. So this really put economists under a harsh glare, and they didn't really have any answers to this problem. Fortunately for economists and also for the world, a new economist emerged, a guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And he had a very different understanding of the economy, very different from microeconomics, because he focused on the entire economy. That's why we call him the father of macroeconomics, because he really focused on the broader picture. And when he focused on the broader picture, he came up with the insight that what governments should do when we enter a recession is they should increase their spending. And that if governments increase their spending, that will limit the length and severity of a recession. Now, if you think about it, this insight that Keynes had is very connected to this concept we studied before of the circular flow diagram. So if we look back at the circular flow diagram, think about what Keynes was saying. He was saying, well, what happens in a recession is that the households, right, individuals in the economy are freaking out, right? They've lost their jobs, they're nervous. So you can imagine that households are spending less. And if they're spending less, that means that they're purchasing fewer goods and services from businesses. Now, businesses suddenly have all these products that aren't being sold, and they're freaking out too because they're trying to right, sell the products they have, not make more. So they're trying to reduce the value of production. This is why GDP is going down in a recession. And they are going to end up, right, spending less themselves and laying workers off. So we're trapped in this cycle. And it's difficult to see who's going to break this cycle. This is also impacting government too, because the tax rate, the taxes that households are paying are going down because households have less money, less income. Firms have less money, so their taxes are going down. So if we don't do anything, which again is what microeconomists suggest, basically we've got an entire downward spiral, and we could include the rest of the world in that logic. Okay, but everything is going down. We get stuck in this cycle that, right, is self-reinforcing. So what Keynes realized was he said, well, there's one organization that actually has the flexibility to get us out of this dilemma. And that one organization is the government. What the government can do is they can actually increase spending. And if the government increase spending, they're going to increase spending by giving more money to firms by purchasing more goods and services. And they're also going to be giving more money to households through government programs. And so that slowly households are going to say, oh, we have more money, right? The government is providing more money for us. And then they're going to start increasing their spending because they start feeling more confident they have a little bit more money. At the same time, the same dynamic describes what firms are feeling now that the government is purchasing their goods and services. So firms feel more confident, and so they start producing more, and they need to hire more workers to begin this process of producing more. And then suddenly, rather than being stuck in this cycle where the economy is shrinking, you are back in an expansion. And this was the fundamental insight that John Maynard Keynes had about we have to look at the overall economy. We can't just look at a specific market like the labor market because these organizations are so fundamentally interconnected. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do is to take a few minutes, press pause, and to answer what does Keynes say is the solution to recessions? Okay, why was this solution based on macro and not micro? And then what was the issue with the micro solution? So in your answer, make sure you talk about how the micro solution was in effect do nothing, okay? Explain why they looked at the labor market and recommended doing nothing. And then the problem with sticky wages, the reason why doing nothing worked. When you talk about John Maynard Keynes and why his solution was different, be sure to bring in the idea of the circular flow diagram. At this point, you can press pause. Hopefully, you were able to make the argument that the solution proposed by microeconomists was to do nothing because they believed that in the labor market, the equilibrium wages would go down and supply would thus equal demand and the unemployment problem would be addressed. But that didn't happen because of sticky wages, because we don't adjust to that new equilibrium point and we get stuck with more supply than demand, which causes unemployment. In order to get out of this situation where we're stuck, John Maynard Keynes had to look at more than the labor market. And he was able to do that by looking at the overall interactions between organizations and realizing the one organization that could get us out of a recession is the government, and that's why the government needed to increase their spending.